Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to you for the presentation of a book organized by SUERF for the European Monetary and Finance Forum and hosted by the Oesterreichische National Bank. Besides those here in the room, I welcome also those 60 plus who are on the screen. Thanks for joining us here. As you know, today we talk with Sir Paul Tucker, who is currently research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, about his new book, Global Discord, Values and Power in a Fractured World Order. And the presentation of the book will last about 30 minutes. And then we have two renowned experts from the national relations, which will present their views of the book in another 10-15 minutes. And then we will have a quick panel view here in exchange, so giving Paul Tucker a possibility to react to the comments, and then some reaction to the reaction before we open up to a Q&A session. And for those who are online, they are invited to use the comment section in order to bring their question to the floor, and I will get informed by the staffer. Let me introduce Paul Tucker in a few words. Paul spent more than 3 decades in central banking, occupying senior positions in international monetary and financial policy world. Up to 2021, he was chair of the US-based Systemic Risk Council. And before, Paul was deputy governor of the Bank of England, and during his tenure, he contributed to containing the financial crisis, 2008-2009, and reshaping the international regulatory framework for financial stability. So he had his part of the fun in his life already. And he also held important functions at the G20 Financial Stability Board, Bank for International Settlement, and Basel Committee for Payments and Settlement Systems. Paul graduated from Cambridge, where he studied mathematics and philosophy, so I would claim the typical career of a British academic in economics out of it, mathematics and philosophy, and has been a fellow at Harvard University for many years. And I think that's the reason why we're all here. We admire him because he's an acknowledged master of interdisciplinary thinking with a profound understanding of economics, philosophy, history, and international relations. So these are all areas he touched on in this book, but also in his prior book that we all, like to read very much. Before giving him the floor and also introducing the discussant, let me say a few words about the book. So it essentially, before he talks, I will give you my spiel. I think it's useful, and because it is a very important book with the title, as I said, Global Discord, Values and Power in a Fractured World. And I think the subtitle is more telling, because it says how to sustain international system of cooperation in the midst of geopolitical struggle. Because as we know, already before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, geopolitics had become increasingly fractured, raising questions how the international economic and legal system can survive amid now the contest between democracies and authoritarian or illiberal states. And my reading as the book is that Paul lays out very nicely the principles of a sustainable system of international cooperation, and he applies this to the international order, including the role of the US dollar, trade investments regime, and the financial system. And in his book, he tries to bridge the realist and the idealist school in international relations theory, emphasizing power and interest without sidelining morality and norms and the discuss and will then, I'm sure, enter into that and tell me whether I'm right or wrong in my interpretation. And Paul claims also that incentives must be aligned with values of international institutions such as WTO and the IMF in order to endure. But on legitimacy, a system of international cooperation should consist of consensus circles and hence closer cooperation with like-minded countries in peaceful coexistence with others which are dissenting countries. So something which is not fully new, but still, how to say, in this application, I think quite an important positioning. And regarding the rivalry between China and the US, Paul doesn't draw a deterministic conclusion, according to which a new court area would inevitably be the outcome. However, he wants to be prepared, that the West is prepared in case this is going to happen. I think generally my take is the book eschews wishful thinking. While precautions make sense, on the one side, defensive strategy may be perceived as a threat of security interest by the other side. This, of course, raises the question of how can we avoid a dynamic security dilemma that might end in wars. And on this, Paul is cautiously optimistic about international geopolitical developments, and he gives several reasons for that. First, democratic systems remain attractive to their stability and flexibility via trial and error. I think this is one of the main things we claim in this area. Secondly, commercial-oriented societies tend to become democracies over time, albeit not automatically. This was the thought we had for some time, and we had found out it's not so mechanical. And third, despite differences between democratic and autocratic societies, we need to stand together to tackle challenges to existential global public goods. So, and particularly the climate change is one application to this consideration. And this is the part which, of course, is closer home for me. Paul's deliberations on the national organizations and the specific role and shortfalls. He mentions there that is the question whether the legitimacy of the mandate of the IMF is still conserved. And here, Paul does something which is a blessing to my heart, is that, how to say, that he calls the IMF for self-restraint in order to pursue this global stability there and to focus on its key task. And I fully agree on this one, that the IMF should refocus on the key task and have a policy paper under development, which I will soon, how to say, float around, because I think that's an important part where otherwise I'm afraid, how to say, the IMF will lose out. So after this little, how to say, interpretation on my side, I only need to introduce now the other two renowned scholars which have agreed to present their views in this 10 or 15 minutes. On my right, your left, we have Professor Karolina Milewicz, a chair of global political economy at the University of Bayreuth. So we hear no Wagner today, we hear international economic relations. And before coming to Bayreuth last spring, she was professor of international relations at the University of Oxford. And her theoretical and empirical research focuses on the role of international institutions, law in promoting international cooperation. And she's particularly interested in issues related to multilateralism, treaty making, and preferential trade, if this is a fair characterization of your work. And to my left and your right, we have Professor Michael Waibel, a professor of international law at the University of Vienna. He's teaching and writing and focus on international law, national economic law, sovereign debt, and national pursuit. Previously, he taught also at the University of Cambridge, University of St. Gallen, and Harvard Law School. And he worked also at the European Central Bank, the World Bank, and the National Monetary Fund also questioned him about it, because he also had at one moment stances there. And without that further ado, it's a lengthy introduction, Paul. I may give you the floor, and we're all listening very carefully to the important messages. The floor is yours.
Well, Mr. Governor, thank you very much indeed for hosting this. It's incredibly kind of you and Ernst to do this, and it's marvelous to see former governors and deputy governors with whom I work closely in the quite distant past. There's a chapter on Basel, as it happens. And thank you, all of you, and for who anyone's watching, for giving up your time to do so. Thank you especially to Karolina and to Michael for agreeing to be commentators. I am immensely grateful to them. It was one of the reasons that I wanted to come to Vienna to speak here. But it's also absolutely wonderful to be in Vienna again, wandering around. If you're from England, and I mean England, it is, well, I mean England because of where the Roman Empire ended in the northwest of Europe, and where it ended in the eastern part of Central Europe. And I'm very conscious of what the Danube meant to where we are from. I want to thank Michael especially, though. Anyone that buys the book and looks at the acknowledgements will see warm thanks to Michael. The most important thing to say to you is Michael co-authored a book on the political economy of bilateral investment treaties. And I mean this, it would be hard to write a better political economy book. In my former life as a central banker, I really didn't know very much about investment treaties. I'll have something to say about that in a moment. I was relieved when I found Michael's book, and it really is very, very good. And having read it, I chose one of the three authors. I can't quite remember in my mind why I chose Michael, and I mailed him, and I said, well, actually, this book's it's not very old, a little bit old. What should I do to kind of get up to date with the literature? And some people don't bother to respond to mails like that at all. And Michael responded very warmly. He also, for those sitting in this building, I don't think I would have said this if we were speaking in the university, he is one of the few scholars that has written about the law of the international monetary system and how it relates to the international law of cross-border investment and trade. And since I have discovered that academia is about as siloed as the policy world, Michael is someone that builds bridges in academia. I'm actually between academia and the policy world. So I feel very lucky to have got to know Michael a bit. So thank you very much both for agreeing to discuss the book. No idea what you're going to say, so I'm going to change my mind about being happy to know you later on. This is not an economics book, but it is a book with implications for participants in the international economy, and in particular for international economic policymakers. I'm going to say something about the book is about 450 pages long. 350 pages are one argument. The argument lasts 350 pages, and then there's 100 pages of applications. The book is not structured like this, but for anyone that's interested, the argumentative structure is as follows. It starts with a conception of legitimacy, applies that in what I hope is a contribution to international political theory, grafts on some geopolitics and takes that to international relations, and then descends through principles, which I think are practical as well as principled, for participation in international regimes, and then applies that to the main economic regimes. A few discussants have suggested that I should have done a chapter on security, and actually I think I should have done, and in some respects I concentrated on the economic regimes, partly because people can't pretend that I don't know about at least some of them. I want to say something about geopolitics. I think that we are in a phase of the world that will last for over a century. I think the contest between the People's Republic and what I'm going to call the West, but actually I mean any constitutional democracy, so most certainly including Japan and Korea, is going to go on for a very long time. The comparison is often made between a standard rising state and an established state, so between the Second German Reich and my country. I think that's rather misleading in many respects. I think for our world it is more like the long struggle roughly from 1689 to 1815 between Britain and France. And what is instructive about that comparison is it was everywhere and it was in everything. And there were phases when Paris and London kind of tried to reach an accommodation. There was an 18th century trade treaty, which everyone had great hope for, and then actually it subsided into war again. And that moment wasn't recaptured until the 1860s. There are many people who are economic commentators who think that vulnerabilities in the Chinese economy will cause it to stall in some way over the next 5 years, decade or so. I think that's quite plausible. I don't have a strong view on it. What I do have a strong view on is if and when it occurs, I think many of those people will say, well, that's it, back to normal, US hegemony, the West has prevailed. I think that's nonsense. Even though I don't expect many people to listen if and when China does stumble. China has critical mass. It can afford to build up a massive military without depleting too much the improvement in the living standards of its people. If it stumbles, it will recover. I think part of the contest will play out via international regimes and international organizations, which I'll say more about. But I think it's important to emphasize here, this is a world we're entering where policy silos are going to be a bad thing, which isn't to say that they won't persist. If I look back at my previous life, which is quite a long time ago now, it was possible to be a monetary policymaker and a financial policymaker of my generation without knowing very much about trade policy at all. You had to know about trade economics, but not about trade policy. I think that's impossible where we're going. Even if someone knows about monetary and financial policy and trade policy, they didn't in the past need to know about security policy or human rights or environmental policy. I think that is for the birds as well in terms of steering. Let me tell you a story. The book begins with this. I can't remember exactly when, sometime late 2008 or early 2009, I was deputy governor, so it's early 2009. Somebody walks into my room and says, the Federal Reserve have refused India a swap line. Doesn't matter what a swap line is, it's a line of credit. So the Federal Reserve was refusing the Reserve Bank of India a line of credit to help India navigate the fallout from the implosion of the Western banking system. And my response was, it's too late to do anything about it, but my response was, don't they realize India is going to be a power? And the point I was feeling, because I said it kind of with rather more emotion than that, was that the decision that the Fed had made was above its pay grade. Which isn't to say that I think that central banks should make foreign policy. I don't think that at all. But I do think it's going to be impossible for Western capitals to navigate the new world unless policy specialists are sensitive to the interests of other parts of their government. This was a decision for the State Department and the White House. And possibly the swap line or credit line should be provided by the US Treasury, funded by the Federal Reserve. I don't know. But I just thought that insulting Delhi wasn't a very sensible thing to do. In fact, it's turned out to be okay in some kind of depressing sense, because in my view, the most significant event in 2020 was the border skirmish between the People's Republic and Delhi in the north of the country. I think that will be historically more important than the pandemic. So that situates where I am mentally. That's the point of going through that, is that you can see where I'm coming from, even if you don't agree. The book runs with 4 scenarios. The book has a low road and a high road, and on the whole, I'm going to concentrate on the low road. The four scenarios are lingering status quo, superpower struggle, new Cold War, and a restructured world order. When I started writing it, which was about 4 years ago, and actually even before that, in 2016, when I gave a lecture in London that turned into this book, I thought we were between a lingering status quo and superpower struggle. Except in the monetary sphere, I think we are now between superpower struggle and new Cold War. That's become rather more obvious, I think, than when the bulk of the book was written in 2020. I'm not going to dwell very much on international relations theory. It is dominated by three schools of thought: a Hobbesian realist school, which is mainly about power, a Kantian idealist school, which is mainly about values, a middle way, which finds some inspiration in Hugo Grotius, which is largely interested in, it's kind of rationalist in spirit and deductive, which I don't think is the best way of proceeding, but it's more interested in interconnectedness, interdependent. It's kind of pretty obvious to anyone, though, that actually we live in a world where power interests and norms all matter. And so what the book tries to do by harnessing David Hume is to find a way that is coherent and doesn't have to find itself in one of the corner solutions occupied by most of the standard schools of thought. The other important thing to say about the book is that the high road is that legitimacy is the cornerstone of the argument. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, other than to recall something between British history and Holy Roman Empire theory in the beginning of the 19th century. There is a tug of war between the legitimation norms that managed to hold a balance of power together, as in the concert of Europe, and the legitimation norms that each state has at home. Metternich, as you all know better than I do, wanted to use the concert of Europe to not only hold together the concert, but also to underpin monarchical absolutism. And Castlereagh in London was having none of that. He thought we could have the horizontal legitimation that maintained the balance of power without having to sign up to a creed about how we should each govern ourselves. And Paris took the side of London in this, but they were largely in no position to do anything else in the circumstances, whereas Moscow and Berlin were with Metternich. And the point here is not to criticize Metternich at all, actually. It's merely that this idea of a tug of war between the legitimation norms that hold powers together in some kind of peaceful coexistence and legitimation norms which hold a political society together vertically within a state can be in tension. And that's where we're going to be. And we're going to be there because the legitimation norms that any of us have are a product of our own history, and our history is very different from the history of China, where our is now truly us. Somebody that reads a summary of the book could be excused for thinking that it is an anti-Chinese book. It is not. I have deep reservations about the role of the party and the role of the party in international affairs, partly going back to when I lived in the Far East 30-odd years ago. It is incredibly important for me, and for those of you that go to international meetings these days, I think it is incredibly important that we're sitting around the table with Confucian heritage states that are constitutional democracies, and that South Korea and Japan and others have become constitutional democracies without losing their sense of who they are or where they come from or their traditions. And this kind of slightly trivial point is, I suspect, going to be one of the most important things in the 21st century. I want to remind you about the nature of the party. Remember that actually Davos has just happened. I was described in a UK newspaper the other day, being actually rather nice about the book, as a recovering Davos man. I never went to Davos when I was in office. Nobody from the Bank of England went to Davos when we were in office. They did start to do so later for reasons I don't completely understand. Leader Xi appeared at Davos a few years ago and got great applause. I doubt very much whether the people applauding knew about Document 9. So who knows, I ask this at every single event I speak at, who has heard of Document 9 or the 7 No's? Nor had I before I read the book. Had either Karolina or Michael heard of Document 9? No, okay. So Document 9 was leaked from the Central Committee of the party in 2013, and it contains several no's, the 7 No's. And essentially the 7 No's are a kind of creed against everything that we stand for, of who we have managed to become, against constitutional democracy, universal values, civil society, complete marketization. I think we could agree with that, actually. Journalism via freedom of the press. It is an absolutely creedal statement of what the party is against, and it wasn't just issued as a kind of piece of fluff. It was sent to universities and schools and organizations as something that they should abide to thereafter. This is 1 year after Leader Xi's emergence as leader. As the governor mentioned, the central tenet of the book is that we can afford to cooperate more deeply with those we fear less and have most in common, but nevertheless we must find some way of existing peacefully with other great powers. It is realist in that it opposes wishful thinking. It is realist in that it espouses robust policy. For economists in the room, you'll be familiar with that. Minimax, minimize the costs of the worst plausible outcomes. Most international realists, including Professor Mearsheimer, are not realists in the sense of pursuing minimax. We could discuss that if you like. It means that systems and regimes need to be resilient and can bounce back under pressure. Legitimacy is a feature of resilience. This idea of resilience has tremendously important consequences for policy in the real world. I'm going to get to the practical applications in a moment. I want to pick out 3 of the principles for international cooperation I espouse. One of them is don't enter into any schemes which are likely to threaten local order and legitimacy back home. This, by the way, is tremendously important in that a kind of central thought of the book is that we must cooperate where we can internationally, but not if we lose order and legitimacy at home. So the book is not cosmopolitan in its, with a capital C. Nevertheless, I think liberal states should have a bias to universalism in international organizations so far as there is room for coalitions of the willing to go further. And finally, and this is the one I'll develop in a second, we should not let international judges and international organization bosses rule the roost over us. So, some practical applications. How long have I got left?
I would say we have an hour, quarter of an hour, we're good.
Okay,
so
that would be easy. Yeah, thank you very much. So let me rehearse to make the big point. The WTO chapter is chapter 17, and it has one big point, and it's a point that is best illustrated by a case that went to the appellate board of the WTO about state-owned enterprises in China subsidizes external trade. So the Chinese state was having state-owned enterprises do that, and Washington argued that these were illegal subsidies under the WTO treaty, and that therefore they were entitled to apply countervailing measures. It's not very complicated than this. Subsidy pushes the price down. The countervailing measure the tariff would push the price back up, taking things back to where they were in the beginning. Beijing said no, the United States was not entitled under the treaty to apply those tariffs because actually its SOE subsidies were not illegal subsidies. It didn't deny that they were subsidies. This went through the normal panel process up to the appellate board. The appellate board agreed with China on the grounds that they were not illegal subsidies because state-owned enterprises were not, I think the term of art is policy bodies within the meaning of the treaty. So there are two things to be said about this, one small, one bigger. First is, of course, it's a very silly judgment. But it's partly a very silly judgment because the appellate board was out of its depth. And it was out of its depth for a deeper reason. So what you'd normally expect to happen in those circumstances, certainly in a parliamentary democracy of the kind that I come from, but actually in most democratic states, is that the judges would make a backward-looking decision, and everyone would respect that decision. But if you thought it was crazy for policy going forward, where crazy is the two most powerful people in the world are disagreeing, and that disagreement isn't going to go away, you would expect there to be, in a domestic system, some change in the forward-looking law. In the international context, some bargaining session between Beijing and Washington, perhaps with Brussels and Tokyo sitting there too. And the outcome of that bargain would be Beijing's gains would go down a bit, and Washington's losses would fall a bit. They'd improve their position as well, and perhaps similarly for the other great trading powers that I've mentioned. And that would be a new equilibrium, and there would be a new norm that was somehow codified into the acquis of the regime, and we would move forward to the next move in the game. That can't happen, and it can't happen because everybody around the WTO has a veto. So, well, that's actually slightly unfortunate because the WTO people thought that it would have the spirit of the liberal economy. And so maybe we should change the rule. Well, everyone has a veto over changing the rules, so that's not going to happen. So there are two conceits in this. The first conceit is that the people that wrote the WTO treaty thought they were writing the final word. So I'm looking at people that I knew when I was a policymaker. This is very silly. This is very silly indeed. And actually suggests that they hadn't thought deeply about their craft. It also reveals something worse than that, in that the kind of background thought, the thought, of course, in the Clinton administration and in perhaps both Bush's administrations, is that economic liberalization will lead inexorably to political liberalization. And if the spirit of the book is David Hume, in a sense, David Hume's Commercial Society has that kind of optimistic tone to it. But we have already learned in the 20th century that whilst commercial society can bring people together, the book ends on that note, economic integration does not preclude conflict. I mean, the extent of the economic and financial integration between the Second Reich and the City of London is hard to exaggerate. I mean, the First World War was a trauma for the Bank of England and the people around the Bank of England, precisely because it was so close to all of the banks from broader Germany that were in London. So we know commercial society doesn't stand in the way of conflict, even while we have the optimism that it brings people together in slow motion. I don't see any solution to this in anything like the near term. I think nearly all of the action is going to be in regional trade treaties, and I think that underlines the extraordinary bad decision of the Trump administration not to enter into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I've deliberately left lots of things hanging there. If I turn briefly to bilateral investment treaties, there are lots of frustrations with them. This is a completely different kind of regime to the trade regime. There is no multilateral treaty. There is no organization. There have been lots of attempts going back to the mid-1940s to establish an organization. They've always hit the buffers. And the disputes aren't state to state, but aggrieved companies to host state with arbitration. This is criticized for being opaque, for depending upon a shifting population of adjudicators, on adjudicators that have conflicts of interest. And some large states have more fundamental objections to firm host state adjudications and would like a different kind of system altogether. There is a review of all this going on in UNCITRAL. In fact, I think Michael was saying there's a meeting this week in Vienna as part of that exercise. My view, for what it's worth, is that it would be unwise at this point of modern history to set up a treaty-based body and court system unless one could found a design that avoided the problems that I think the WTO has. But actually something much greater is going on, that to the extent that over the past 25 years people have been very relaxed about cross-border investment, we have become now quite nervous about forms of investment that could be used to compromise the integrity or security of a state. So we are seeing a wave of inward investment controls as well as outward investment controls to avoid unwilling technology transfer. My feeling on this, for what it's worth, and I don't say this, I think that COCOM during the Cold War may have been based here, and I think the Wassenaar Treaty body may be in Vienna. I may have the European city wrong, but during the Cold War, the Western states all had similar controls, and you have a coordination problem. It's no good Berlin having one set of controls if Paris has got a different set of controls, because it's pretty easy to get around things then. So I think what will happen probably as years or decades pass is that there will be coordination of inward and outward investment control structures. Now onto the themes of this building, right? So, and there is a message for Europeans here, actually, which, why don't I kick off with this? Because it will give you something to bite on. I think those Europeans who think, well, the dollar's very irritating, and Washington's use of the dollar as an instrument of power is very irritating, we ought somehow to promote an alternative reserve currency, all of which is completely understandable. I think one should be careful what one wishes for. We live in a continent which has basically outsourced our security to Washington. And to protect ourselves without their help, we would have to emerge as a great power again, which would require, I wouldn't rule that out in certain circumstances, but I mean as a positive prediction. But I think that when people moan about dollar policy, they too often forget the relationship that dollar hegemony has to the US's role in keeping the sea lanes open and in keeping us safe. We should expect Beijing to want an international reserve currency because the attractions of being in a political bloc with the dominant reserve currency are enormous. And it's not just the seigniorage and the lower borrowing costs and the advantages that gives to the dominant currency issuers banks. It's something else. Those of you that were in economic policy during the financial crisis will remember, or watching it will remember this. It was extraordinary, actually. So the United States, its banking system is built on sand and collapses, and that brings down the whole world. Same is true for parts of Western Europe as well. And for any other place in the world, what that would cause is that it would cause its bond yields to rise. And instead, the opposite occurred. There was flows of money into short-term treasury bills and short-term treasury bonds, which made it cheaper for the United States to support recovery in the US economy and therefore economy in the world just in their hour of need. So the ultimate self-insurance came from the role of their currency. So of course Beijing is going to want this. There are certain things that one can say about what Beijing will want that aren't in the slightest bit critical. I mean, of course they will all want that. It does mean, though, and I think this absolutely goes to policymaking in the international monetary and financial community, that there's nothing we can do about that. But it means that the kind of Western monetary and economic policymakers, you must be very careful not to make mistakes. That Austria hasn't been part of this problem. I'm not actually sure that Germany has been part of this problem, but many capitals, certainly in Washington, have been against doing anything against shadow banking. And that's the people that lobby against shadow banking do not see that this is actually a national security issue. The West cannot afford to be the epicenter of another financial crisis. In terms of more current affairs, there's right now, it's the middle of the day in Washington, and there'll be some move in the game of the debt ceiling issue. They're talking about silly coins again this week. And this game is conducted as though it's entirely within the Beltway, as though it's part of the hard-nosed game of American politics between the Republican Party and wings of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. No, it's not. It was, last time it happened, it is not anymore. That if they make a mistake and they hit the debt ceiling and there is a technical default, this is a gift to Beijing. I can almost read the presentations around the world as the PowerPoints go out and say, you should just reduce your holdings of dollars relative to other currencies. You don't have to come into ours, you go into the euro or something, we just reduce your holdings of dollars because we've seen that their system isn't working, etc. And I think this is a manifestation of the continuing siloization of policy, that people think the game of domestic politics isn't part of the much more serious business of preserving our way of life, which is what I think. We could talk about digital coins if you like. I'm going to skip over that. I want to say one thing about the IMF and then one thing about Basel. I normally don't get to Basel in these presentations, but I'm going to because you may be able to do something about it. I do think the IMF should stick to its business. And when I was writing the book, I was concerned I was being unfair, because of course it's now over a decade, well over a decade, since the IMF decided to completely restructure Indonesia's way of life. And even then, given the element of corruption in the Indonesian administration at the time, there was a case for saying that the IMF's overreach in Southeast Asia wasn't quite as egregious as many of us thought that it was. But actually, I still think that the IMF hasn't learned. It's unfortunate the example comes from my country, but it does. So we had a kerfuffle, as we would say, in our system of government in the autumn, where we had a government for a couple of weeks that had a budget that caused all sorts of volatility in financial markets. And the IMF intervened and they made a statement and they said, we don't like this budget at all because it will exacerbate inequality and it will mean that monetary policy has to be tighter than otherwise. So the last thing didn't need saying because it was obvious, but harmless to that extent. The first thing's got absolutely nothing to do with them whatsoever. Still a functioning democracy, and one could actually agree that it might exacerbate inequality, and it still has nothing to do with them. But something did have something to do with them, which is they didn't say the thing that they could and arguably should have said, which is we're somewhat worried that this budget you've published doesn't have any fiscal framework for the future, and therefore doesn't anchor things to the future. And we think you do need a fiscal framework, and we look forward to discussing that with you in the Article 4. So, and I hope that people in Washington are listening, and I'll get an opportunity to present it there. You said something that was irrelevant, you had said something that was none of your business, and you didn't say the thing that absolutely needed to be said and was your business. And so culturally they still haven't got it, I don't think. And that, I think, is quite surprising. It's unfortunate the example is my country, because I have no brief for anything any government has done in the UK. The Basel Tower, let me end here. The Basel is interesting. It has, because it's not treaty-based, and because it's soft law, and because it's variable geometry, it has degrees of freedom that may in some respects enable it to navigate the new world of geopolitics better than some other bodies. I think there are special conditions in which that can, preconditions for that to work, which we could discuss. But I want to say something else, which is the problem Basel has, and I think it had when I was there, and I don't think I did anything that made this worse, but I don't think I did anything that helped solve it, which I regret, is it manages at least to look too close to the banking system. It has meetings with the big banks and now with the big asset managers that are behind closed doors. Well, since the reason for having international accords is partly because the bankers don't have incentives to internalize the wider costs of their failure, it's at least bad optics to look too close to the banks. And I think the solutions are twofold. It could be a mix of these things. Either those meetings, many of which I attended, should be live streamed, or more weekly, a record of them should be published, or meetings with civil society should be held as well. And it's perhaps spending a little bit of time in the United States that sensitized me to just how much suspicion there is of central bankers and bank regulators getting together, because they must all be in the hands of the banks that they all go to work for later. Some final note, though, and this in a sense is this goes for European states' relations with Europe as well as it does for international organizations with the world. Another story is that during the post-crisis reforms that you mentioned, Mr. Governor, one of the two members of Congress that led the Dodd-Frank legislation, I'm not going to say which one it was, said to me, "Paul, we know that we're really just incorporating into our legislation lots of the G20 agreements and thinking that you're part of, but we can't say that here, because that will make it harder to get through Congress. But I want you to know that we understand all of that, and we're grateful for what you're doing." And I think this is a terrible mistake, actually. Just as European countries, EU countries, this used to be true of London as it's true of Paris. The only time I ever got a standing ovation in my life is when I said this at a conference in Paris. People go off to Brussels and they say one thing at the Council of Ministers and they say another thing when they go back to their own country. And the Council of Ministers should probably be televised in the way that the US Senate is. But similarly, those of you that go to international policy meetings, when you are taking your domestic policies from international agreements, say so. Because otherwise the public will never know. And otherwise the public won't understand the extent to which they benefit from international cooperation. And why on earth should they know about it if actually policymakers pretend that everything is designed and grown and implemented at home? So I hope you will see some tensions or contradictions in all of that, as it sounds at times quite internationalist, and at other times not very internationalist at all. And of course the book is an attempt to make that coherent in some way. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you much. I think in this slide series, so many things we could stay here for the whole evening in order to discuss them, particularly your last part. And while you're looking for the presentation, the point I would like to make when you say more transparency, my experience is, and I've been here, so that the call for transparency sounds always nice. And think about, I'm sure he has been involved in Article 4 document before was not published. And so it was much more candid and relevant ever since it's published.
Oh, no, I don't disagree with that.
Exactly.
I absolutely.
Transparency is great, you know, but it creates endogenous reactions, which how to say so. That's the reason why otherwise you do the talk along the couloirs and others out of it, but was just to hand over, and I give the floor now to you, Professor Milewicz.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin by actually saying thank you to Paul for the opportunity to read such a rich book. A book that actually is not a given in our, at least not in my generation of scholars, because usually we stick very much to the narrow field we know very well, and we do not reach beyond our own discipline, right? And I think what you try to accomplish here is quite an ambitious project. You come with a depth of a practitioner, and actually like with the spread of knowledge from very many disciplines, and I find it just very incredible to read such a book. So I guess that's our role as academics to praise before we get into the hard criticism. Yeah, so I'm not going to be like super critical. What I would like actually to do is to take advantage of that, what my expertise is. I'm a scholar of international relations and of political science, and I would like actually to mention four aspects that are very crucial in the book, and I think that are actually underlying the whole argument in the book. And they are related actually to the role of international institutions, the question about how can we make sure that institutions can endure in the long run. The second point, I think, is that you also mentioned is the aspect of incentives value compatibility. And that is, my translation of incentive values compatibility is actually the interplay of power and democracy or liberal values in international politics that underpins actually that kind of endurance of international institutions. So the question of how can we make sure that international institutions can be maintained and prevail in international politics, the key to that is actually in democratic states and in the domestic sphere. So those are very important two topics that I consider to be very central themes in IR scholarship. And what I will do then next, actually, like to go a little bit also into values, talk about this interplay of power and values, and then ultimately talk about your four scenarios about the US-China rivalry. I think those are the big themes I consider very central in your book. And Michael will be then talking more about the nitty-gritty economic aspects, I assume. So let me begin actually with the very first point about international institutions and the endurance of international institutions. Perhaps before I continue, I should mention I use the cover of your book on those slides, to make sure that the audience knows that this is actually referring to your argument. I will also refer to my book and also use my cover of my book basically to present a kind of counter-argument, to present an alternative. Yeah, no, that's not an advertisement for my book, but I think like just to make sure that the audience knows where the arguments belong to. So let me begin with the first point that I think is very crucial for basically maintaining international cooperation. It's international institutions, and whatever you just said about all the specific institutions, I think is very true here. We have to think very carefully about the design or redesign of international institutions. So enduring institutions also means we have to change them, and changing institutions is not as easy. And Paul lays out actually in the book two ways of how we can make sure that institutions operate in international politics. One option is basically changing institutions by design, by a very conscious design that is coordinated among states and is actually very much informed by the interests and capabilities of states. So that's the one option, the one pathway of changing institutions. The other one is by spontaneous evolution, right? So we have custom, and that custom can help us over time to actually achieve perhaps our desired outcomes. It might take longer. So the way Paul presents those two pathways of let's say institutional change or institutional endurance is not as a binary, but actually he argues and gives compelling examples that they can actually go hand in hand. I think all that is very true. However, I believe that it's also very optimistic. So I think institutional change is actually more difficult, and I think the book could have emphasized that a little bit more. So I think the difficulty of institutional change is a little bit underappreciated. And here are 3 reasons why I think it deserves a little bit more space or a little bit more discussion here. One problem is power. A lot of international institutions that actually deal with high politics, and by that I mean also security politics, do really require very conscious state consent. Because without that, we actually can't arrive to an outcome. So power politics on high politics international institutions will actually be that will determine the outcome. Another aspect that I actually consider very key in this argument is the problem of past dependency. So the longer an institution is in place, the more sticky it becomes. And if institutions become sticky, they obviously constrain the actions of actors and policymakers. And that is something that we really have to take as a background condition, partly because the way the book is written is it almost feels that institutions operate in a vacuum, right? We think about an institution, we create this institution and we design it without regard to what we actually have. And what we have in international politics is not an anarchical environment, but we have an environment that is highly institutionalized. So whatever we change, we have to change against this institutionalized background. And I think that is something that is very important, and that actually informs very much what can be done and what can't be done. So the most carefully designed institution, and you mentioned that actually also with regard to the WTO appellate body, the most carefully designed institution might work in a particular context today, but might not work tomorrow in a very different context. And that's the problem. So we always are faced with the problem of incomplete contracts. That's a very economic, very clear statement, right? But we have to be aware of that. So an institution will be always incomplete in its design because it fulfills a particular purpose at a particular point in time. And the WTO, or dispute settlement body, is one example. Another one is the Security Council. There have been attempts to change the composition of the permanent members in the Security Council, and it's very hard to change, right? Because no one wants to give up power. And that's part of the problem. So I think power, past dependency, and the kind of time and contextual environment do play a role. And I think when we think about the endurance of international institutions, we also have to appreciate that change is just more difficult than it sometimes seems. And here I would like to reach out to what I actually did in that regard. Something that just goes beyond this kind of particular design of individual institutions, that basically takes a kind of more meta-level picture of international politics, and that I actually call constitutionalization. Institutions very often, I mean, policymakers do have in view what they want to achieve in the short term, right? With regard to a particular institution. For example, if they create a treaty, they are aware what the costs and benefits of the treaty are. The problem is, creating one treaty is fine, but over time we accumulate a number of treaties, and this accumulated number creates a kind of architectural environment that is hard to predict how that will interact and operate. And that actually can entrap state makers. And also ultimately also contribute to a kind of institutional inflexibility and inefficiency. So the argument about institutional endurance and institutional change, we can take even to another level and say that from the kind of meta perspective, there's even a kind of entrapment that states might face. So that's on the first point about international institutions. Now I would like to move to the next point that I consider very important in Paul's book. It's values. Paul does actually a great job arguing for how we should actually bring in values in. And he also does a lot of work thinking about what kind of values we should actually consider being important coming from a constitutional democratic perspective. However, to me, I think it is not as clear as it could be. So I have a quote here from Paul's book, basically telling us what those values are supposed to be, and I hope I picked the right quote. Western-style constitutionalist values without relying on the program of global constitutionalism being incorporated into general international law. So those who are not familiar with global constitutionalism, it's a very value-laden concept, right? Underpinned by a lot of different rights, liberties, duties. But the way that statement reads, I understand our values should be purely formal procedures, something like public justification, public debate, which I think is important. However, is it sufficient? Is it sufficient to actually create a kind of common denominator among the states we want to have on board? Because if it is just as formal procedures, any illiberal state can accept them. And is that not a problem? I'm not saying we should want to exclude them, but we want to make sure that there is something going beyond that. So the questions I want to raise here is like, what are the values that we are talking about and how do they operate? And how do we actually like bring them from the national level, because those are the values we are used to have at home, to the international level? So those are the questions I have about values. I worked on values. I think it's very, especially on the values within democracies. And I'm not going to talk in detail about that, but I agree with Paul that the procedural rules are very important. The rule of law, or what we also know from Hart's work called secondary rules, are very important rules in order to create a kind of legal basis for an international community. But I think there is more to that, right? Especially individual basic rights in a domestic context, or individual self-determination, taking the form of elections and participation, political participation. They create a kind of compatibility between domestic rules and international rules, and enable states actually to aspire internationally to something that they know from home. Beyond that, the question is, how do we make sure that constitutional democracies or liberal democracies actually can cooperate over time and can maintain this international order and endure institutions? And there are mechanisms at play, as I lay out, and we can talk perhaps in a Q&A session about those, that are crucial, actually. And I think like democracy is not just self-enforcing, it's self-reinforcing, which is a very important mechanism that actually creates a growing network of like-minded states that happen to be liberal states. That would be my argument for why I think the democratic values we think about are very crucial in the context of the book. So there is a compatibility, almost like a duplex compatibility, working vertically and working also horizontally, that are very important. The third aspect, which is connected, is actually the interplay of value and power. I think it's very, I found it very intuitively very right and very correct to bring in values back into play, but also think about how do they interact actually with power. So the interplay of power and values is what Paul calls incentives, values, compatibility, which is a theme in the book that is almost, it has a different layer in the book. It's almost floating in the book without being very explicit. I find it very important. And what Paul is actually saying is almost a policy recommendation you are making by stating that for international system to be incentives, values compatible, we need our leaders and officials to take our values with them to international tables. I agree with that. That's very important. We have to not only think about what our preferences, our interests are, but also what values do we represent? What is the morality behind all this power politics? But is it not already what states do, or leaders do? And perhaps they are not going with an explicit list of values. Those are the values we would like to have. Those are the values that we actually would like to have actually adopted at the international level, but are they not coming with a mindset from their home countries? And what I mean by that, I mean they socialize in a certain culture, political culture, and they come with this kind of mindset of certain values to the table, right? So what I would like to hear a little bit more is how does it actually play out in actual real politics? And you are the expert on that, right? Because I did some kind of academic work on that, thinking about what I call it actually the logic of democratic power. We could call it like the logic of incentive value compatibility, if you want. Thinking about like what are the states who are actually most likely to push for cooperative outcomes internationally. And the way I actually see it, so I come up with 4 categories of states, and my expectation is that the highest likelihood for cooperation is among states that actually come with those kind of, they have the capability to change something internationally, but they also come with this willingness, with the right set of values behind it, and I call them democratic powers. and that would be a country like US, it could be a country like Canada, and they are faced with an opposition, and I call it autocratic opposition. They have different values. That might be Russia, that might be China. But yeah, I think I would like to hear a little bit more how you think, from the very practical perspective, what this interplay looks like. I turn now to my final point, the US-China rivalry and the scenarios. I like actually the scenarios. I think that's something that academics are not very good at, trying to basically being a little bit more forward-looking. We are always very, at least when you use empirical work, when you do empirical work, you are very backward-looking. And I think that's something that Paul does very well. He's very forward-looking in his book. And, but I think I do not view the scenarios the way Paul presented them as 4 alternatives. I actually think that scenarios 1 to 3 are actually stages of escalation of the rivalry. And scenario 4, for me, is the true alternative. Because it's the alternative that actually claims that we might come up with something that is a different order, a different governance structure, that rising powers will have perhaps a voice at the table, that IOs will be reformed. So that's a different set of scenario than the other 3. Lingering status quo, superpower struggle, new Cold War are stages towards a new Cold War, right? So I wonder, how should we think about those scenarios? And here are, what I would like to offer here is a kind of different reading of those scenarios. And it might sound very gloomy, I hope not too gloomy, but I think taking that what we know from international relations theory, I think we could think about it perhaps in a different light. So regarding scenarios 1 to 3, I think we should take into account the power transition theory. The power transition theory is a theory which actually is concerned with the situation where we have a hegemon or a major dominant power in politics, but this power is actually challenged by a new rising power. So that would describe actually very well the situation that we have now between US and China. China is on the rise, US is the dominant power. And once the rising power reaches power parity, with the established power, and is actually dissatisfied with the status quo, we might expect that there will be an escalation of the conflict. And I think this theory actually describes very well what we observe with regard to the US-China rivalry. And to make it even worse, when we actually take this kind of compatibility of power and values from a kind of scientific perspective, and really look at that picture through this kind of power and values perspective, the question is, what are the values that they share? And there's not much ground, right? So what are the common values that US and China share beyond this kind of economic benefits that both are actually aspire to? And that might actually create even more dissatisfaction and actually accelerate the tensions between the two countries. I'm not saying that this is my view, but I think it's an alternative view, right? A kind of dramatic scenario for where those relations could go. And I think it's just for the plenary to think about it, right? Where do we see that going? Regarding the final scenario, I would like to come back to this kind of institutional stickiness. I think it's really key here. As I mentioned before, reforming the Security Council is very difficult, and no one wants to give up power. So if we think about a reformed set of international organizations and rising powers at the international table, where do we see them? How do we see them? Don't we need another crisis, another major world war in order to make this change happen? Because this is very often the trigger for a change to happen in international politics. But I'm not saying we have to have that, but I think reaching scenario 4 will be very hard, or at least at the ground picture it will be very hard. So perhaps in particular institutions it will be possible. So I would like to conclude. I'm actually not sure how I do on time. I would like to conclude by actually emphasizing again what I really like about the book. I think it brings our values back in, and that sometimes are an aspect we forget, especially when we talk about the China-US rivalry. It combines and brings together an incredible reach of disciplines, which I think is very, very seldom, which I really, really appreciate. And it actually confirms a lot of our empirical work that we have done in political science, in law, and in economics. And it has the advantage of all this kind of scientific work that we normally see, that it actually takes a step further and thinks about what kind of policy recommendation can we make. So take my criticism really as an encouragement for the discussion, my attempt was here to fill perhaps with some alternative views, to make us think about what are the mechanisms and what are the definitions of the concept we actually use very often. But thank you for this book again, Paul, and it was really a stimulating reading. And I think we can now move over to Michael.
Thank you, Michael. I think there's a lot of...
Thank you very much, Governor Holzmann, and thank you to Karolina and Paul. It's a great pleasure to engage with your book. Global Discord, in my view, is refreshingly big picture on economics, politics, international relations, history, as well as international law, my own field. In my view, no academic could have written this wide-ranging and stimulating book, and I cannot do justice to it in the time available. Leading international lawyers feature in the book, including Hans Kelsen, the father of the Austrian Constitution, his student Hirsch Lauterpacht in Vienna, and the Australian jurist James Crawford, both of whom rose to fame as Whewell professors at the University of Cambridge. International tribunals, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the appellate body of the WTO, and investment tribunals feature in the book too. And so does the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, concluded in this city. It is part of the plumbing of the international legal order, similar to the plumbing of the international financial system. The book's starting point is that geopolitics is back, or perhaps more precisely, that it never went away. And a first important implication of that is that economic and security policymaking, as Paul has mentioned, need to be more joined up than they have been in the past several decades. A good example of geoeconomics is the question of the world's reserve currency. And here, Paul predicts that the US dollar's incumbency is deeply entrenched, that bearing big mistakes by US policymakers, this will be the status quo for some time. That said, there will be challenges, initiatives to bypass sanctions, and efforts to internationalize a digital renminbi. Paul calls for what he calls jurisdictional modesty in respect of US dollar-based transactions, and this raises several questions. Is the use of the US dollar in international transactions itself a sufficient link with the United States? And where does extraterritorial jurisdiction begin, and when is it problematic from a legal point of view? I will touch on three themes: the compliance of rising and established powers with international law, the role of basic human rights, use Kogan's, in structuring international cooperation in concentric circles, and swaps extended by central banks as a geopolitical tool. Paul draws an interesting contrast between the island of Palma's arbitration in the 19th century, where a rising power, the United States, complied with an adverse arbitral award that found that legal title to the island of Palmas, a coconut-strewn, minuscule island in the Pacific Ocean, rested with the Netherlands rather than with the United States. And the approach that the United States took at the height of its power, exemplified by its non-participation and non-compliance with the judgment of the International Court of Justice in the Nicaragua case. Territorial disputes are, as Paul rightly underscores, among, and I quote, the most fraught and dangerous sources of friction between political communities, and thus present a hard case for cooperation among states. The US approach to Nicaragua, in turn, created a precedent for China's non-participation and non-compliance with the award of the arbitral tribunal in the South China Sea. Throughout the book, Paul does not mince words. Basel II is, I quote, disastrously flawed, and the constructive ambiguity around lender of last resort policy deeply flawed. In a short section entitled "The United States Goes Rogue," Paul details US disengagement from international law, its rejection of international law tout court, a trend that he says predated the Trump administration. He draws a parallel between the contemporary approach of both China and the United States. Both maintain a schizophrenic cherry-picking approach to the international system, including international law. Examples of US disengagement include the Second Iraq War without a clear UN mandate, creating a major legitimacy hit that made it easier for rising states to claim that the US-led international system has been a sham, and the imposition of steel tariffs against allied states, which WTO panels found last month are unlawful, conclusions which the United States has immediately rejected by saying that it will not cede decision-making power over its essential security to WTO panels. The president of the American Society of International Law said in response a few weeks ago, "It would be helpful if the Biden administration were more pragmatic and less ideological. That would lower the temperature. Importing steel from Norway neither was nor is a national security threat." Paul highlights the US view that WTO adjudicators should not have the final say. And it's this concern that has led the United States to become increasingly disaffected from the WTO. It shows the limits of judicialization and of what Rand Herschel calls the dangers of juristocracy, the rule of judges. That said, Washington seems to struggle with the notion, win some, lose some. The United States has never lost an investment arbitration. And with its economic and political capabilities, the United States is undoubtedly better placed than most states, such as Sri Lanka, Peru, or Ghana, to comply with international awards. Turning to my second theme, the role of basic human rights, jus cogens. This is in keeping with Paul's call for giving up thick universalist morality and focusing on thin morality, norms that are widely agreed, such as the prohibition of genocide or slavery. No doubt, Russia is currently beyond the pale, outside the concentric circle. But other cases seem harder. Is there one rule for the current superpower and another rule for everyone else? Do constitutional democracies enjoy a privileged position? What happens if a constitutional democracy, or several, breach jus cogens, such as the prohibition to use military force, which is a jus cogens norm? Think of the Second Iraq War. Another jus cogens norm that doesn't feature in global discord is the right of self-determination, particularly in the colonial context. When Mauritius became independent from the United Kingdom in the late 1960s, it attached what became the British East Indian Territory, the Chagos Archipelago. A few years ago, the International Court of Justice found in a non-binding advisory opinion that the UK had breached the right of self-determination. Liz Truss, during her short premiership, decided that it was no longer tenable for the UK not to live up to its international obligations. And a third question in this context is whether there is a breach. Who decides whether there is a breach of jus cogens? The UN Security Council, it is clear, cannot in practice perform that function. And I come to my third and final theme, swaps extended by central banks as a geopolitical tool. Global discord predicts that we can expect competition as regards swap lines to heat up, especially when it comes to China and the United States. These swap lines are an example of geopolitics at work. Paul mentioned in his remarks the example of the Fed refusing such a swap line to India, which in 2008 was already a power with more than 1 billion people and nuclear weapons. Perhaps this was a way of preserving hierarchy and power and making clear that India was not yet at the top table. And that points to a major problem, I think, with swaps as they're currently extended. Many states cannot and do not benefit from swaps, entrenching a core periphery pattern in the international monetary system. How does that fit with Paul's call to constrain regime-specific and system-wide hierarchies for the benefit of weaker states? Some states have now standing swap lines, whereas many others, such as Turkey and Argentina, have to turn to other sources of hard currency. And one final question on swaps is, should it be central banks themselves that decide to whom these should be extended? Or is this, as Paul says, beyond, above their pay grade? Should this be decided by their principles? Global Discord is a fascinating read. It's an ambitious work that contains much learning. It contains a wide range of ideas and concrete proposals. When you read the book, make sure that you also read its final paragraph, which is both surprising and beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you much. I think we had a level of discussion which, at least in my cases, exceeded my understanding, some of it, in the sense of going back what kind of philosophy is behind. Now we can stay at this level and hopefully bring somebody around here, or what I would suggest to go one more level down where I find myself, and how you see solutions to problem. What we have, for example, the swap line is an example. The question is, why do we need it, and what the kind of what is, if they were to be extended, what would the contribution to it? Because the way how it was characterized, it sounds like, okay, some get it, others don't get it. From my point of view, of a central banker and former IMF or person of missions, is you do a swap line if you want to provide liquidity, so in case a shock happens, people can survive. But you wouldn't extend the swap line if and as this person, this country has a non-sustainable financing gap, which cannot be covered by a swap line, for which you need to have a program. So if you like the euro, how to say, it's useful to extend the swap line for countries which have trade relations, and then of course a crisis happens, then the money goes out of the country, so you want to avoid that, and by offering a swap line you avoid it because you immediately demonstrate we help you. But if a country has an unsustainable position, then doing a swap line would neither have the country or help yourself. So I have difficulties to get this to the table. I'm a simple person, you know.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what central bank governors always say. They go around saying things like, I'm a simple person. I can remember my first boss, actually one of the most sophisticated people I've ever encountered, probably. I kind of have an answer. Let me first of all just say one light thing, not about the deeper stuff, but about how Karolina began and Michael began. They both began by saying, and I want to put this neutrally, goodness, this is wide-ranging and deep. We couldn't write a book like that as academics, and that's something which my generation of academics has said. And where that fits with the theme of the book is, my prediction would be that the generation of academics after you will write wide-ranging books again. That I think that siloism, whether it be inside the central bank or in academia, is endogenous to the security that we have been able to take for granted. That this specialism is, if you like, an artifact of peace. Whereas if peace is seen to be in jeopardy, I think people will feel the need to break through disciplinary barriers. Of course, that won't be easy for all of the reasons that you know better than I. And Michael's variant of this is, Michael kind of listed the various things I touch on, and well, more than touch on in truth. For what it's worth, Mr. Governor, and for those of you that work in the Austrian Central Bank, I would say that you do need to know about the history of international institutions and international law, and that you do need to know about the Vienna Treaty and treaties. And if I look back at my own career, I don't actually think it would have been possible to do my job today without knowing those things. I think I was part of a generation that didn't need to know those things because we could take so much for granted, although actually I also regret not knowing. I mean, I sometimes joke that I'm almost approaching the point where I might be qualified to have held the office, which I held more than a decade ago. In answer to your question, which is that there are two ways of answering it. The first way, is the higher level way, but higher level in a practical sense, is, so I do need to explain at this point what a swap is. A swap is something where I'm the Federal Reserve, I lend dollars, and I take as collateral the currency of the central bank that I'm lending to. So if it's a swap with the Bank of England, I, the Federal Reserve, lend them dollars, I take sterling as collateral. If it's with the ECB, I take euros as collateral. If it's with the Reserve Bank of India, I take rupees as collateral. A precondition, in a narrow sense, for my entering into the swap is that I think the currency I'm going to take as collateral is going to hold its value over the lifetime of the swap facility. What they do with the dollars I've lent to them, or euros or sterling, if they on-lend it to banks or whatever, that's at their risk. My risk is only the currency I've taken as collateral. And that's what the governor is getting at when he says, well, actually, I need to form an assessment of whether this is a safe currency to take. But the consideration, and I completely agree with that, and I think that for the central banker, that is then the end of the central banking thought process. I think in the State Department or the White House or in the Chancellery, I think there is a further thought process, which is that if you want people to use your currency around the world, and they have a liquidity crisis, they are not going to be able to get themselves out of the liquidity crisis unless they can raise, for the moment, dollars, in the future, renminbi. There are two ways of doing that. One is to hold dollar securities in advance, to hold foreign exchange reserves. And one of the good things that the Federal Reserve has done during the COVID crisis is they have made it far easier for foreign central banks to turn US Treasury bonds into liquid dollars. They could have done that in 2008, 2009. They've done a much better job recently. The other way, but to hold vast foreign exchange reserves, you need to run some kind of cumulative current account surplus, and that may not be the greatest thing in the world for broader reasons we could get into. Alternatively, you need to make a line of credit available. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that there's a slight tension here between the narrow one is I'm lending my dollars or whatever against this currency, have I taken good collateral? And the broader one is I want to underpin use of my currency around planet Earth. Well, why do I want to promote use of my currency, or why should we Europeans be content with the Americans to promote use of their currency? Well, because of the tie to their role in keeping the sea lanes open, that it actually underpins their security hegemony. And that just goes above their pay grade. And I think that Michael posed the question, so where does this leave the central bank? And in some respects, I think it means that the Treasury departments may need to enter into swap lines where they don't think the currency is safe collateral, but they decide to take the risk for geopolitical reasons. But I don't see why in those circumstances the central bank shouldn't fund their Treasury, offsetting the money creation in other parts of their operations. And there will be, I think the audience already, there'll be, my goodness, but this is monetary financing of the government, and kind of technically it is. And I think even some of our restrictions on that are an artifact of living in what seemed to be a safe world. But if Beijing makes a massive success of providing renminbi swap lines, I predict that the constraints that everyone wants on dollar and euro swap lines will become less constraining.
But on this one, I fully agree with you, and I claim, how to say, over the recent years, I was very instrumental of extending swap line and repos in Europe, and how to say, I did it with letter to the council, successful there. But the example you put there with China, there a swap line is not the question. They don't believe they cannot pay back. They have enough for how to say, for exchanges.
I don't mean a swap line with China. I mean China providing.
And now exactly what they have out there. It is always a question of, do you think this is a friendly country, a hostile country? Is it something where, say, they could be available to have the swap line from the point of view of consideration of security, but I don't want to do it because they don't fulfill a certain condition. I fully agree with you that we got to India, I would have given one.
Yes.
But in many cases you have a situation where you say, okay, I'm doubtful about the capacity, but I also I want to use this as an instrument. So using of swap line is something you want to use. If you don't use it, you make a wrong decision. But it's not only an economic one, the way it is, it's also something.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So actually, this reminds me of a story about the 1970s. So Bretton Woods falls apart, and everything's going wrong in the United States, Watergate, Vietnam, everything else. But crucially, the dollar is no longer tied to gold, and the whole world is no longer tied to a commodity standard. That takes about 25 years to cure. But in the meantime, Washington is very bothered about the position of the dollar. And one of the most fascinating negotiations in modern times occurs. The expression modern times is hugely overused in the United States. I actually think this is worth it. So a delegation goes from, I think, the State Department to the United Treasury to Riyadh to enter into a new bargain, one of the two grand bargains of the modern world, which is Saudi Arabia commits to carry on invoicing in dollars, and Washington commits to maintaining and even extending its security umbrella. This actually is the best example of non-siloism. When I was talking to the late Paul Volcker about my book, this was the kind of thing that his generation of policymakers absolutely understood, not because they were always more virtuous, but because that was the world in which they lived. Whereas we have lived in a world where, the central bank didn't need to think about, or the Treasury Department didn't need to think about State Department policy in the same extent. I want to add something at this point, responding to Karolina on institutions and the Security Council. I'm going to try and weave in responses to you as I go. So I think the interesting thing about the Security Council is not membership of France and Britain. It's that by pure chance, the first great power to emerge after the Cold War is already a member of the Security Council, the People's Republic, because of the switch from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China in the 1950s sometime. I think if India rises as a power, I think the Security Council will break, or there will just be another body. I think whether it's the Council of Europe or the Security Council, I think these formal bodies kind of put into positive law something that is actually produced by some kind of balance of power. So I don't think an institution like that can codify change into itself. I think for at the very top of things, if order really is a precondition for everything else, I think there just will be change, and everyone will kind of want change, because India could, if India becomes as powerful as I think it may be, India will just say, well, if you're not going to do that, here is what is going to happen in response. And then there will be this vector of things that we don't like, whether it be trade with Europe, trade with the United States, something in some other part of the world. I think the argument has to be more subtle, or richer for institutions lower down the food chain, the institutions that I would.
To bring India to the table, you will need to create another forum, right, for that.
Yes.
Because right now we don't have an exit option at that level in
Yes.
that sphere.
Yes.
So we have to do that, and either we do it the formal way, or so an alternative formal organization, or we do it an informal way, which is right now the way to go, right, for many spheres, so in international
Yes,
politics.
and my prediction is it would be organic,
Yeah.
and then it would become inorganic,
Yeah.
and people would, and in a sense, the G20 kind of presents a kind of place for conversations of that kind to happen.
A question to you, but I will ask whether the question for the outside, because you mentioned WTO and Basel, and what I see is that in one case there's no reform, there's a lot of not reform, there's a lot of sand in the way how it is operating. So the question is, and the reforms and everything seems to be difficult, whereas in the area of Basel, 1 to 3, there's still, despite all this, a lot of cooperation taking place. So we have on the one hand in the trade area a major obstacle, and in Basel. So the question is, what are your arguments why it works on the one hand, not on the other hand? But before that, do we have questions, please? And then we have it here from afar, and then I take those three here. Okay. Do you have, Brennfelder, haben Sie eine Frage?
Yes, Governor. Indeed, we do have two questions from the chat. One of Robert McCauley. We may ask him to voice up directly. Ready?
Yes. Will or should the Fed's extension of swaps to Brazil or Mexico in the future take into account their stance on sanctions on Russia?
Okay. Thank you. Next question, please, Mr. Brennfelder.
And another question is Jussi Lindgren. I guess I will have to pose it. She asked, or no, she will voice up. Okay.
I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so
Yeah, we hear you.
oh great, thanks. I'm just thinking, finishing your book, Paul. It's a great book. As an application to the European Union, I'm thinking of on your view whether there will be a realistic chance for the euro to become an international reserve currency, in the sense that the bonds issued by the EU, the European Union itself, would somehow provide a safe asset in terms of international sort of multipolar regime of reserve currencies. And in that sense, do you see that the current way of expanding the sort of use of the EU budget without a proper treaty change, do you see it legitimate in terms of, for example, the prospect of establishing some sort of a sovereign fund in order to have a sort of an answer for the American industrial policies currently? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I take the three questions here. We're taking one in line. I think David, and then I had two hands up there. Yes, and then behind, exactly. David, you start out.
Is there a mic?
Yes, it's coming.
Yes, well, I've got lots of rather complicated questions, but let me just put one. The whole question about the Strategic Defence Initiative at the end of the 1980s, that was something that you could say is very relevant to today. So I wonder what the panel think in general about the fact that in those days you had a certain American technological, military and monetary dominance. But we seem to have all those things now almost squared in the use or the possible use of American technological dominance against Russia, and then as a proxy against China. China has got lots of ways of possibly fighting back against this, the IRA, also the question about the sanctions vis-a-vis the high-level semiconductors. So if you throw all that into the kind of potpourri of your book, Paul, and stir it all around, all those ingredients, what results, what comes out at the end of the cookbook? go back to cookbooks. What comes out at the end of the cookbook if you throw in all those ingredients?
Thank you. Please pass over.
Well, so Paul, thank you very much for your presentation and for the book, which I think is takes a very holistic approach and is really in the theme of the old Humboldt world of universities. So thank you for that. And I also wish some of the regulators and central bankers would take this more holistic approach today and hopefully in the future. Coming from the macro to the micro perspective when it comes to the swap discussion, I know you came up with a lot of proposals with regards to the non-banking world in the past, and Claudio Borio and the Round Tower in Basel just published another paper about the size of FX swaps, which is in the size of 80 trillion on the off-balance sheet side for non-banks. And for non-US banks, we have US dollar FX swaps obligation, which are 2 times the size of the on-balance sheet debt. So I'm just wondering, with regards to transparency, what you described for the WTO and the Basel Committee, wouldn't it also be absolutely necessary to get more transparency when it comes to the off-balance sheet size of debt here at the corporate level and the non-banking world? And with regards to your home country, if you have any comment on what happened last September in the UK with regards to the gilt market, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And we finished this round. Yes, please.
Thanks a lot. That will be a quick one. Actually, I would be interested to understand a bit better and to have you elaborate a bit more on a point that you made on the Basel Committee. In particular, what makes you believe that if you would live stream the discussions of the committee, that there would be much more buy-in and less skepticism? We've seen this also in the Council of the European Union, this behavior which is really repeatedly switched on and switched off, and it did not lead to much more belief or less skepticism. And just, better understand where you come from in order to make this a better situation overall. Thanks a lot.
Paul, a lot of questions are to you. The question you have towards him, we can have over dinner, because this is the ones that will say the policymakers he would like to have answered, Paul.
I'm going to go backwards through them. On the Basel Committee, the point about televising or live streaming wasn't about the meetings of the Basel Committee itself. It was about the meetings that top central bankers have with private bankers. So as a deputy governor or governor, there are meetings with the top bankers or the top asset managers. And I mean, and the bankers don't turn up unless they think they're getting something out of it. And I suppose the same could be said for the officials. But civil society is quite suspicious about that. And actually, I think since the whole point is about externalities and spillovers, the costs beyond the private costs of failure to the bankers themselves, I think you can make a pretty good case instrumentally for having a dialogue with what people call civil society. I don't actually like that expression myself. And certainly in terms of kind of our values, our democratic values, participatory values, I think you could say, well, why are we just talking to one interest group? Why not to other interest groups? I think doing this isn't straightforward because lots of NGOs, if you like, are just as much stuck in Davos as the top bankers. I think getting to kind of real regular people, other than via politicians, elected politicians, isn't a straightforward thing to do. But nevertheless, I think something could be improved, even if it was just publishing transcripts or records of the meetings. On shadow banking, I mean, it's no secret that I think that there has been dereliction in this area, and it's no secret that I think that there's no hindsight in that. I think the only thing where I've changed my view over the last decade, but quite a long time ago, is that a general policy would be needed rather than a policy of we will do something about manifestation X of shadow banking when it is manifestly big enough to be a threat to stability, because by the time it's manifestly a threat to stability, it also has lobbying power, both in Washington and in Brussels, perhaps especially in Washington, but Brussels too. And I just think you should get on with it and do something. And that's, I guess, addressed, especially more to some capitals than others. And I think ultimately Europe may have to go it alone if Washington can't move, which, you know, and I understand that isn't easy. But if you never do anything and there is another crisis, that will be bad in terms of what you all do. But I'm saying it would be bad in terms of preserving our way of life, because that's a gift to Beijing. I don't think I have anything to say about the gilt market crisis other than that I don't think it bears very much on world affairs. And the parliamentary system worked quite well. It didn't go very well, and so that government fell. And our constitutional system worked. People around the world said their constitution isn't working very well. That's how our constitution works. Government doesn't do very well, gets sacked. It's set up that way. And this goes to our point about institutional change. There's nothing very brittle about the British Constitution. The British Constitution's got some problems, but it doesn't have brittleness subscribed into it. Whereas when we come to the WTO, I think the problem with the design of the WTO is that it was brittle. And it was brittle in one particular state of the world, which is the rise of a great power that is illiberal. I mean, why shouldn't there be a great power that is illiberal? I mean, you know, we may want it to be liberal, but designing institutions on the basis that that couldn't happen, that was incompetent. And I think we're entitled to look back and say that was incompetent. To David's question, I think the one-line answer is avoid over-dependence. And where over-dependence could make you vulnerable. And I think that would be symmetric. And I think this goes to a point that Karolina raised, which is she presented, and I don't think this is unreasonable, presented my scenarios 1 to 3 as stages in a game. Where I think that's true is that they could all be equilibria in their own right, and they could all be long-lasting equilibria. Superpower struggle is probably an unstable equilibrium. Lingering status quo and new Cold War could be stable equilibria, subject to kind of massive exogenous shocks of some kind, which could be a technological change. The reason that bears on David's question is that to the extent that we live in a world between superpower struggle and new Cold War, it's how do you new Cold War, where it's kind of fully autarkic or semi-autarkic economic blocks with a little funnel through for, I don't know, energy or a currency or something, that is obviously depletes world wealth. It makes people less well off around the world. So you want to avoid getting there if you can. But you want to also avoid being in a superpower struggle because you want to avoid the costs of autarky, you've actually rendered yourself vulnerable. And I have no prescription, there is no prescription for this. If it means that we can't be siloed, it also means that the people that lead in Washington and Berlin, Paris, Brussels, to some extent London, Tokyo. I mean, my goodness, they're going to have to be big people again because of the gravity of the choices they have to make. Working backwards to the question, the technology is fantastic that we could hear Robert Macaulay's voice. I think the spirit of my answer is the same. I think my answer is maybe. That's a big decision for Washington to make. It's a trade-off between what are the short-term advantages and long-term advantages of being very tough on Brazil and other capitals, because they've got the answer wrong now. And whilst not driving them into the opposing camp. So I think Washington has handled Delhi pretty well over this period, and I think Delhi, given its own objectives, has handled itself pretty well against the backdrop, though, of the border problems in 2020, which caused the revival of the Quad. And in some respects, the revival of the Pacific Quad, if you're sitting in Washington, may outweigh the aggravation of Delhi's ambiguous path towards Moscow over the recent months. We can't, a country that's been committed to being non-aligned since independence from my country's former empire is hardly going to then jump into different camps. So I don't have a clean answer, but in a sense, I would want that discussion to take place in Washington. I would want, if they are not disciplined for it, it's important that Washington policymakers know why and know how they're going to communicate that and what benefit they want to get from not punishing Brazil and others over the next 10 to 20 years. It's no good thinking about just the lifetime of a particular administration. I think I also know the second speaker, but I didn't hear the second speaker's voice, and I apologize and hello. So I think it's tremendously important that we in this part of the world, whether it's the euro or sterling, don't think, well, actually, it's all very irritating, this dollar stuff, and we ought to boost the euro, because we get our security from them. And we need to probably spend more resources on our own defense, because they are very stretched everywhere on the planet, because that's what being the hegemon means. I think they've been slow to see that. I think my country's leaders in the 19th century were better at understanding that, which is quite an interesting thing. But I don't think we ought to think there's a free lunch where the euro, because it is the most stable currency in the world, until recently the best central bank in the world, can somehow, that there's a free lunch in terms of promoting the euro as international currency. There isn't. And the advertisement for that is Germany tying itself in knots as it confronts moral dilemmas, meeting realpolitik decisions that it hasn't yet learnt how to deal with, for reasons rooted in its own history, that atonement turns out not to be enough. You have to have confidence in your moral judgments as well. And the truth is that it's easy feeling comfortable with your moral judgments if you were on the right side of formal moral conflicts. So I don't at all think it's easy for Berlin, but it does show us why being casual about the euro, replacing the dollar, would be a mistake, because our continent is not ready to defend itself without their help, and that is a big thing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think after this strong message, it's time to stop here. Couldn't get stronger. And thank you very much for being here. I think thanks, Paul, and the two discussants for their, highly valuable inputs, which, we hope to can pursue now the ensuing discussion. And see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Governor.